Remember the old saying, the first thing to say about politics is that politics is not the first thing. It's downstream from the main thing, which are families, churches, and schools. And when those three are thriving, then politics can be healthy.
Welcome to the Narrative Podcast. I'm David Mahan, your humble host this week. Mike Andrews just decided he wasn't going to come to work today. And Aaron Bear's out there like he normally do, would do, making more work for us. So I'm here with Bishop Chris Lightfoot, the Executive Director of the Church Ambassador Network. What's up, Chris? Man, good to be here today.
Oh, it is good to be here with you, David, especially without the other two. It's more fun with you. So
we don't need those.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. I'm in the Mahaniac fan.
That's right. We run this town. Man, we've got an incredible interview coming up here in a minute with Os Guinness. But I wanted to take an opportunity to talk about the work that you guys are doing in the Church Ambassador Network for our pastors, working with, it seems like, almost every major denomination. Like, give us a little update on what's going on.
Yeah. Oh, man. So we're in a season of the Lord's favor for sure. What the enemy intended for evil, right, God has used for good. And coming off of the abortion amendment in 2023, just to put this in perspective, at that time, we had about 2,200 churches in the Church Ambassador Network, and today we're over 5,000. And I think in large part that's because pastors are hungry to help their people understand the times and know how to respond. They're hungry to fulfill their Ephesians 4, equip the saints for the work of the ministry, specifically in today's cultural context. And we've really tried to lean into that since that abortion amendment in particular and go upstream. And so upstream for us means biblical worldview, resources, and tools. It means family, a focus on this Hope in the Future initiative that helps the local church build out full circle relationship ministries and lean into evangelism through the renewal of relationships and marriages and families. It means dual citizenship, but rightly ordered dual citizenship that places an emphasis on our heavenly citizenship. And because of our heavenly citizenship, we want to be good stewards of our earthly citizenship. Yeah. We don't just want to abandon that role that God has given us, that good role that God has given us for government. So those are a few of the things that we're really leaning into. And it just seems like this is a season where pastors are hungry for that right now.
And I'm glad you brought up where that came from, right? Because we and I joke about Aaron running around finding work for us to do. And that kidding, not kidding. But things are always moving and progressing, and we're always advancing in CCV. But it's important to remember why what we are doing now, the importance of it comes out of where we've come. Mm-hmm. And those of you who are listening, you remember the vital signs report that we put out where God really put it on Aaron's heart to say, wait a minute, I know the election is over, the abortion amendment election is over, but we're going to put some resources in to exit polling to figure out what was the tail of the tape. Because everybody was talking, blaming the left, blaming, a commercial, blaming the media. Mm-hmm. But what we found in the exit polling was, it's kind of like OSU, right? The OSU versus Michigan game, right? And so, they're playing, but only half of the team for OSU showed up. Right. And they get their tails beat. And at the end of the game, everybody, all the commentators are sitting there talking about, hey, was it the offense? Was it the defense? Was it, how great Michigan was or was not? No, the real question is, the only question is, where was the team? Right. See, because the exit polling said for the abortion amendment that half or a third of the body of Christ just didn't show up, right, to defend life. And then a third of the body of Christ, weekly attending believers, voted for abortion.
Yeah.
And so the question was, okay, well then how now shall we live? How do we move forward into getting this thing overturned?
Yeah.
And so, that was one piece, but there was another piece. There was a piece where the Lord just spent several weeks sharing his heart with us as a team and how that the response from the body here in Ohio, having chosen Barabbas, over his image bearers in the womb, how that broke his heart. And out of that, comes great legislation. Like we're working with, on the legislative side, the state house. Matter of fact, this week we've got a couple great bills, pro-life bills out there. that one, Baby Olivia Act, that basically talks about image bearers and lets these babies preach their own sermons in public schools, right? We don't have to be in there pro-life, pro-choice. Just, if we're going to talk about human development starting in 5th grade in the state of Ohio, then let's talk about all of human development. Why would we cut out the most critical and formative stages? Because like Planned Parenthood said in the testimony in the hearing this past week, because it might change the decisions that kids make pertaining to reproductive, what they do with their bodies, and which maybe it would.
And we said exactly.
Maybe
he would love.
Maybe it would.
Let's give them the full picture.
If truth would do that, then so be it, right? Then we've got another bill out there, that Patient Protection Act, that basically says, look, any pill or drug out there that's got more than a 5% severe adverse effect rate in patients, man, we need a couple doctor's visits, right? We need to cut off some of this online, ordering of these drugs that are harming women. And if that's mifepristone is included in that, then so be it as well. So we've got a lot of the legislative political movement going, but the much larger and deeper work that is going on in CCV's pro-life approach is communio. And so, listen, tell us more about how is that being received by pastors? It's awesome to hear we went from 2,500 churches to 5,000. What does that mean? Like, where are we going, and how are pastors receiving that message of hope and a future?
Yeah. Well, and to your point, the network number is wonderful, but now we are saying, how do we steward that well? How do we deeply serve these pastors so that they can serve their people? And how do we give them the tools and the resources that they need for today? And so 2 things, coming back to that Vital Signs report. First of all, that 34% of weekly church attenders, and I always like to highlight this because it's easy to write that off and say, well, weekly church attenders. No. We intentionally eliminated any denominations that would normally be either just not in alignment with us or might be directly opposed to us on issues like abortion, right? So a lot of your mainline denominations that the clergy in which intentionally and specifically leans left on these issues, we eliminated those individuals from this report. So it's 34% of our weekly church attenders from our conservative denominations that voted yes to enshrine abortion in the Ohio Constitution. The other thing that came out of that report related to the hope and future piece that we then came out with was that our voters were more likely to vote no on the abortion amendment if they were married than if they had children.
That's critical.
And so I've heard you and Aaron talk about this, and so I've just stolen it, and I'm going to say it now and before you can. The pro-life movement has done a good job of convincing people that it's a baby. As a culture and society now, we're just at a point where we don't care, right? After 50 years of the rise and triumph of the modern self, Carl Truman, and with self as the reigning idol of the day, people are saying, well, my autonomy is more important than that human life. I don't care that it's a baby. I know it's a baby. Scientifically, I know life begins in the womb. I don't care. I still have my autonomy and my right to end that life if I want to. Where there's something about the marriage union, there's something about the biblical sexual ethic within the context of the family that caused people to vote differently than even if they were a mom that had kids. So those 2 points really directly led us to go upstream and say, okay, well, we got to start the Ministry Fellowship. We need to give pastors the tools to equip their saints with a biblical worldview to navigate today's issues. And by God's grace, we're now in 7 cohorts around the state. I think it's Cleveland, Akron, Canton, 2 in Columbus, Cincinnati, Dayton, Mansfield, and growing. It's been really a lot of fun to watch the pastors who are hungry for this. And you're going to hear more about that in the interview with Os Guinness coming up. We're using his book for the spring semester, Magna Carta of Humanity, coming up here in January. But then the other piece of that is this Hope in the Future report. So both the report with Brad Wilcox that outlines all the data, and then we said, okay, but what's the solution? If we know that the breakdown of the family leads to all these areas of bondage, and we know that for too long we've just been throwing cash at the fruit and we've not been addressing the root, and we know that the cultural transformation is going to be a much longer, harder process to transform than simply legislation. As important as the legislation is, than simply the legislation at the State House, how do we come alongside the local church and help the local church be the impetus, the catalyst for that transformation in the local community? And we found Communio, and really ultimately Communio is just kind of the guide to help the local church be the hero in that local community. They have coaches that are very good at helping local churches build out full circle relationship ministries, and then with data informed resources, understand their local demographic and reach out into that local community evangelistically to be able to transform that community with the only thing that can transform a community, which is the gospel and the love of Jesus. And it has been a beautiful thing. I think we're up to 13 churches now. We just launched in June, so we're about 5 months in. And the churches that have jumped in, they love working with these coaches from Communio. And I think it's partially because they're not a program, they're not a curriculum, they're not selling a product. They're really just coaches that have done this all over the country, and so they can come into any church, and whatever that church is prioritizing and focusing on in their community, they just help them do it better to advance the gospel and to bring people into healthy relationships. So, yeah, we're really excited about what God is using upstream to have impact on culture and politics downstream.
That's right. And if it was easy, everybody would be doing it, right? But we know that it's been well received, and I'm hearing a lot of excitement as I run around from pastors talking about the work you guys are doing. And your team has grown. Like, your team has blown up. Like, who are you on your team now?
Yeah. It was just me when I joined a couple years ago, and I think the reason we're at 5,000 today is because of my team, much more than it is because of me. So God provided a young woman, Jenna Scott, and Jenna is our church ambassador network coordinator. And we talked about Ministry Fellowship, right? So all of our Ministry Fellowship curriculum is built on a platform called Pathright. Get this, I met Jenna when she and her husband visited our church, and they had just moved up here for her husband's work. And I said, well, what are you doing? She said, well, I'm going to be looking for something. Well, what did you used to do? She used to work for the International Mission Board, which is the SBC's International Mission Board. And she ran all of their training for their missionaries on Pathright. She designed it all. She set it all up. So what a godsend. She's been an amazing addition to the team. And then most recently, Nick Spencer just joined our team 2 months ago as the director of the Ministry Fellowship, and he's doing a wonderful job taking that to the next level. And then Ruth Edmonds, I lied there, didn't I? I said I was alone on the team. Ruth has been leading this charge. Probably most people know Ruth's name more than they know my name.
You said her name was Ruth? Who is this one?
Ruth Edmonds. So Ruth, technically she's in a contract role with us currently. She ran for Congress, she ran for school board, and that was consuming a lot of her time. Thankfully, God has opened that schedule back up, and she's been pouring back into a lot of our churches and pastors. So she leads all of our prayer initiatives, and she has really leaned in on Hope in a Future. And so we have this Hope in a Future tour that we're doing all over the state. Ruth has been key in recruiting pastors and working with us to get those legislators and bring them to the table for these conversations that have just been impactful. So
she's all right.
She's all right.
Yeah. Well, listen, we're getting ready for our next segment. You are not going to want to miss this segment with Os Guinness. You want to kind of tell everybody who he is and why they need to stick around?
Yeah, I've been a follower and fortunately now call myself a friend of Oz for a long time. But Dr. Os Guinness spoke for us at our inaugural Essential Summit last year. Mm-hmm. And in fact, he was the highest rated speaker of all this. So if any of our other speakers are listening to this, I apologize. I just offended you. But of all the feedback I received,
second.
I think you were. It was real.
Somewhere above Aaron.
I think everybody who wasn't above him. So what I'm really excited for with Dr. Guinness, though, is he just put out this wonderful film documentary, Truth Rising. If you've not watched it, I highly recommend it. We've highlighted a couple things that he's done in our monthly newsletter, The Times, this month. But the book that our fellows are going to be going through for the Ministry Fellowship, this Magna Carta of Humanity, he'll talk about it a little bit more. I don't need to spend time on it, but he puts a kind of juxtapose American Revolution from 1776 and the French Revolution from 1789. And he basically says, man, America, listen, in 250 years, we've drifted a long way.
That's right.
And it's time for renewal. We have to come back to a Judeo-Christian biblical view of the American Republic.
Yeah, you're not going to want to miss it. And so stick around for the next segment of The Narrative.
Hey, Narrative listeners. You know, Christians in the marketplace today face more unique and challenging threats than ever before. Businesses are following woke capitalism, chambers of commerce are beholden to social justice, and secular activists are chipping away Christians' First Amendment rights. As Ohio's only Christian Chamber of Commerce, the Christian Business Partnership stands in the gap to advocate for, to educate, and to celebrate Christian business owners. Joining the partnership also allows businesses to provide their employees with healthcare insurance, workers' compensation, and exclusive banking and educational discounts. To find out more and to join, go to cbpohio.org. That's cbpohio.org.
And we're back. David Mahan, Chris Lightfoot here with us today, and we are joined by a very special guest, Os Guinness. He's an author and social critic. He was born in China in World War II, where his parents were medical missionaries, a witness to the climax of the Chinese Revolution in 1949. He was expelled with many other foreigners in 1951 and returned to Europe, where he was educated in England. He completed his undergraduate degree at the University of London and his PhD from Oxford. Os has written or edited more than 30 books, including the Magna Carta of Humanity, which our Ministry Fellows will be reading together starting in January 2026. Os, thank you so much for being with us here on The Narrative. And could you just to start, give us a breakdown of some of the things that you've accomplished and the work that you do all over the world, if we have time?
Oh, David, only the Lord knows what any of us have accomplished. We can mention a few things we've tried, but that's about the limit to it. No, I've had the privilege of living. I'm in my mid-80s now, which means I've been around the track a few laps more than you have, maybe, but I don't know that I've accomplished all that much.
Well, I would say that you have, and I think all of our listeners that are listening to us have been very excited to hear this podcast because of what you have done and the way your works have impacted their lives. I want to lean on you, Chris, on this one. I know we've had you in Oz for our summit, and many of our folks that listen were at that summit and appreciated greatly the words that you had to say. But you are an author of a lot of books, but we wanted to touch on one in particular today.
Yeah. So as we just mentioned in the opening there, that we're leveraging your work in the Magna Carta of Humanity. And Oz, you and our Ministry Fellows Director, Nick Spencer, and I had a wonderful conversation a couple months ago, just kind of exploring how we can move forward with those Ministry Fellows and provide them with some resources, especially our pastors that are in those fellowships, to help them have the tools they need to have the conversations with their people as we head into the 250th and an election year. But there's so much about that book that's really fascinating. You touched on this when you spoke at our Essential Summit last year, but I'd love for you to dig in a little bit to the birth and death of a civilization and explore a little bit the juxtaposition in the Magna Carta of Humanity between the 1776 revolution built on Judeo-Christian principles and the 1789 French Revolution built on Enlightenment principles, and how you see America 250 years after that founding, and where have we drifted, and what are some suggestions, advice, and things that you would say, well, we got to get back to our founding principles.
Well, you've got about an hour's worth of answers in those questions alone.
I know.
I'll start with the 250th. 250th supplies a baseline, 1776, and a benchmark. 250 years is not all that long when you look, say, at the Chinese dynasties or the Egyptian dynasties, which went on for 18 centuries. But it is an achievement. But clearly America's drifted, and so it's going to be a year of reflection as well as celebration. And I'm particularly concerned because the American Republic is rooted in what the 17th century called the Hebrew Republic. In other words, the rediscovery through the Reformation of Exodus and Deuteronomy. And we need to go back and see what it was that formed the founding of God's nation, as it's put, and to see where America has drifted and things need to be remedied and put right. So that's my concern. So the clash, the ideological clash between the American Revolution and the French, that's just one of the crises that's besetting America today. But you could add others. We not only have a ideological polarization, we have an institutional polarization between the elites and ordinary people. And then you have a third crisis, which is even less discussed, which is called cultural climate change, the rejection of faith, the repudiation of truth, and the erosion of social ties such as family structures. And America is experiencing a very serious erosion or unraveling. And so the Republic is really facing immense challenges, and we need leadership that, like Moses or like Abraham Lincoln, will say America has to choose. In America's case, you have to choose between the ideals of the American Revolution and the ideals of the French Revolution. Which do you choose? And leadership means to set up the choices clearly so that people make that choice, and in this case, go back to the best of the American experiment. What a year we're about to face.
You know, we just had an election in New York of Mayor Mondami, and some say he's a socialist, some say he's a communist, an Islamist. But what was your thoughts? What were your thoughts on that election night? I know he had a very large percentage of the youth vote there. Amongst Jewish community, he had over 30% of that vote there. What were your thoughts on that election?
Well, clearly, Zoran Mandame does not represent anything to do with the beginnings of the American experiment and nothing biblical. So the fact that he's doing so well is an extraordinary symptom of where America is. But go back to the events following October the 7th in Israel. You know, you've seen what's called a red-green alliance. 50-odd years of radical cultural Marxism and the so-called Long March through the institutions have now joined hands with more than 50 years of radical Islamism, which goes all the way back to the meeting between the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem and Adolf Hitler in November 1941. So that red-green alliance is incredibly fateful, and it's dead set against everything Christian and everything to do with the American experiment. So America, let me put it simply, it is later than many Americans think. And if we don't use this next year, you know, before the Proclamation of Emancipation in 1863, Lincoln wrote a famous letter to the Congress in which he said, America is the last best hope of earth. Now, I would say as a foreigner and an admirer of this country, there's a bit of hubris in that, but I understand what he's saying. And I would add to that, 2026, humanly speaking, the Lord can break in any time he wishes. Humanly speaking, 2026 could be the last best chance of the last best hope. And so we who are Christians, followers of Jesus, need to be in the vanguard of those who are thinking deeply and calling America back to its best and seeking to remedy the worst.
That makes me think of a couple things. Number one, our kind of mission statement for the Church Ambassador Network here at Center for Christian Virtue is to help the body of Christ understand the times and know how to respond. And I just heard kind of a clarion call there to that the church, the body of Christ, needs to understand the times that we're living in and rise to that occasion. The other thing that made me think of, though, is your recent release with Focus on the Family and the Colson, in which you highlighted some very encouraging stories. In fact, Colson Center did a kind of a write-up earlier this month on 5 Christians who are a light in the darkness, if you will. And so in our monthly newsletter, The Times, I highlighted some of that. But if you would, maybe for those who aren't familiar with Truth Rising, just tell a little bit about what you guys accomplished in that documentary, and the impact that you hope that has, and if there's a couple stories that really stood out to you as impactful when you guys were making that film.
Well, really, it's a film with 2 halves. The first half is saying, where are we? And the central theme there was the civilizational moment, the way the West has lost touch with the inspiration and the dynamism that made it, namely the Christian faith. The second half of the documentary is, what do we do about it? And it was 5 or so people who are making stands of incredible courage. But if you look across the board today, those particular stands, or say the response to the assassination of dear Charlie Kirk, you can see there are lots of good things, but so far they don't amount to much more than a pushback. And what we need is a profound renewal. In other words, the word of the Lord speaking, the Spirit of God convicting, a profound renewal among God's people, and a clear understanding what we're standing for. So the president talks about make America great again. He never says what made it great in the first place. America is a nation by intention and by ideas. And obviously it was the ideas of Exodus and Deuteronomy, covenantalism and all that that means, which shaped America. And we've got to know what they are. I've met many groups, even from the Midwest, who really say, well, of course the roots are Christian and Jewish. They can't go much beyond that and say what they were. But there are at least 9 or 10 basic principles in Exodus and Deuteronomy which are fundamental. And we need to fight for those today, not just as a way of celebrating America 250 years on. I think the best of the biblical roots and the best of the American experiment are the key to the future, what I call a human-friendly future. And we have to counter the growing trends which are authoritarian and totalitarian, and the best counter is with biblical principles, as in the American experiment, with its weaknesses. And we've got to stand on those for the sake of the future, not just the past.
It's been said that religion is key to history, but I did hear you say that faith has largely been canceled in today. How do we wrestle with that, right? If religion is key, which we all know it is, but yet folks are moving further and further away, at least from our Judeo-Christian values. Is there any hope in that? I know you've said that civilizations have a birth date and they have a death date, right? And there's an average lifespan to every civilization. If we're moving further and further away from even discussing our faith or faith in general, where does that put us?
Well, let's just discuss, David, one thing behind what you're saying. Can there be renewal? Now, if you're in a secular world, there can't be. The ancient world was ruled by fate. The modern secular world is ruled by determinism. There isn't a single leading atheist thinker who's not a determinist. So when you decline, you fall. That's the end of it. But decline and fall is not the biblical pairing. The biblical pairing is exile and return. So yes, if you leave the way of the Lord, there are moral, social, political, national consequences. Adam and Eve, east of Eden. Cain, a wanderer. Israel, captive in Babylon. The church again and again being corrupted and declining. But from Moses onwards, right through to Malachi, the Hebrew prophets all had this refrain: if you return to me, says the Lord, I will return to you and restore your fortunes. And so the biblical pairing is exile and return. And that's true in the church too. Think of the awakenings. Think of the great statement by G.K. Chesterton. 6 times, he said, the church has gone to the dogs. But in each case, it was the dog that died. Think of the First Awakening, saving England from the French Revolution, building up to the American Revolution. Think of the Second Awakening, the 1,000 or so reforms climaxed in the abolition of slavery. We believe in the possibility of genuine awakening and revival, and so we need to pray for that. I don't mean a renewal. A mere renewal is something that's sociologically explicable. It's real, but doesn't have supernatural dimensions, whereas the real revival and the awakenings change culture dramatically because they're a profound movement of the Lord. So can there be renewal? Absolutely. And our biblical notions such as freedom even to repent and turn around are so key in the present moment. But will there be a renewal? Well, only the Lord knows the answer to that. Can there be? Yes. Will there be? I don't know. But we must play our part, praying to the Lord, but challenging our people to repent, to turn around, to turn back to better ways.
That's something that my team and I have been talking a lot about is, to your point a little bit ago, we've been seeing sparks of what seemed to be revival, right?
Renewal.
Yes. And that's, so how do we fan that into the flame of the next great awakening of our generation, renewal? And I think you just outlined that, but maybe just especially next year as we're coming into this pivotal year, maybe deepen that a little bit. If you could just speak in particular, I'd love for our pastors to be thinking about, what do I need to do in my role to encourage my people toward renewal, toward the next great awakening for our generation?
Well, there is a movement, Chris, as you know, starting with Capitol Hill, that on the day of prayer next year, the National Day of Prayer, it's to be enlarged to be a day of prayer and national rededication. And there'll be an event in Washington and local events around the country, which will have a number of elements. Celebration, yes. Thanksgiving, certainly. But also, secondly, confession for all America's sins, including the original sin of slavery and racism. And then thirdly, rededication to America's first principles. And that's where pastors come in. Because how many people really know how Exodus and Deuteronomy shaped the American experiment? And we need to have pastors who understand that, not just let my people go, the master narrative of freedom. Exodus is so much more, and it's pastors who can really outline that for us. So you take the three great dimensions of freedom. Gaining freedom, that's the liberation from Egypt. Ordering freedom, that's the covenant, Exodus 19:20, and so on. And then sustaining freedom, that's the building of the tabernacle and the presence of the Lord in their midst. There's an immense richness of principle in Exodus and Deuteronomy, and we need pastors not to be politicized, no, but to show how the Word gives us the foundational elements of a society that takes freedom seriously, justice seriously, and so on.
That's
good. 2026 is a big election year. And many of our pastors struggle with being too political, not political enough. It seems like there's constant pressure from their congregation, and in many cases, both ways, right? Some pushing one way, some pushing another. A lot of pastors don't know what to do. In renewal, what is the role of politics in renewal for the pastor?
Well, let's be clear. We are combating what's called politicization, making everything political. And that goes back to Jean-Jacques Rousseau and came into America in the 1910s and 1920s from the left. And the tragedy of evangelicalism following 1973, evangelicals have become politicized and toxic too. Remember the old saying, the first thing to say about politics is that politics is not the first thing. It's downstream from the main thing, which are families, churches, and schools. And when those three are thriving, then politics can be healthy. And politics is not the first thing. But let me make a different point, David. If you go back to the Hebrew Republic, the Jews had a saying, every Jew is responsible for every Jew. There was a reciprocal responsibility of everyone for everyone, like the Three Musketeers many centuries later, all for one, one for all. That is excellent. You love your neighbor as yourself. You love the stranger because you are strangers. There's a reciprocity. There's a mutuality. Now, the early American Republic was like that. And when Tocqueville comes here in the 1830s, he says the churches were, quote, the schools of citizenship. Every American is responsible for the American Republic. So evangelicals who don't vote, that's not only a failure of discipleship, it's a failure of citizenship. Every American should be responsible for the American Republic, including voting, but never politicizing the faith. Faith is first. Politics is second. So next year, pastors should teach the first principles of freedom, justice, and all these things from Exodus, from Deuteronomy, from the prophets. They don't tell their people how to vote. The people have their own callings, and they can go out into society as salt and light and make their own minds up. They too are citizens responsible for the public. So never politicize the pulpit, but teach the word, including the biblical view of politics. There's a lot of politics in the Bible, but it's never first and foremost.
That was really good. I'm glad you asked that question, because I think a lot of our pastors are already starting to wonder, how am I going to navigate this with my people? Because we do hear that all the time. They're getting pressure from both sides. Half their congregation wants them to be more political. Half their congregation doesn't want them to speak about it at all. And so coming at this from not even a nonpartisan, but coming at this from a biblically partisan approach and saying, no, that we have a responsibility as dual citizens to be good stewards of what God has entrusted to us.
And is it not inevitable to be political, right? Like in my definition, government is God's way of ordering society, right? Politics is man's way, right? That's man's thing, and it's his way of getting needs and wants met within that context of government, right? Family government, civil government, church government, and self-government.
My 4-year-old is the best lobbyist I know.
That's right.
So, yeah.
And so at some point, I think if we define terms, and you may have a different definition of these terms, and the way I would define these terms, there is no avoiding politics. I do love that you're saying it's not the first thing, though, right? Because I think what a lot of pastors are saying is they disdain what they're hearing, the political rhetoric that they're hearing from CNN and from Fox, and they may have members that are listening to both of those narratives. But there's a different narrative. There's a biblical narrative. There's a biblical context, and while we need to avoid being over political or politicizing, I think, we do need to lean in on the issues of our day that deeply affect our congregations.
Yeah. When you make politics the be-all and end of all of anything, you end in the authoritarian state.
There you go.
That's what Rousseau tried to do. That's what Mussolini tried to do. That's the roots of fascism. Nothing outside politics and nothing outside the state. That is obviously not biblical. America should have a separation of powers, for example. But the Jews had that centuries earlier. They call it the 3 crowns of authority. You had a king, you had the priest, and you had the prophet. And the prophet was the guardian of the covenant. And he had the right and the freedom to challenge the king. Elijah to Ahab, Nathan to David. And so pastors are like the prophets if they really teach the word. So we should never politicize life, but we take politics seriously.
In the context of that, what should that look like in the church? I think you mentioned it, Chris, in First Chronicles, the sons of Issachar who understood the times, right, and the ways that they should go. How would a pastor train up the next generation of Issachars, right? Like that know what to do, that are they don't get pulled to the right or to the left politically when they go to college, but they are strong in their faith, but also in their biblical worldview pertaining to civilization and society.
Well, look at the curse of Judaism and the church today. They have many problems, but take the lost 10 tribes of Israel. They lost 80% of Israel, not to a Holocaust. They were acculturated into oblivion. And part of the awful worldliness of evangelicalism, we're getting acculturated into the ways and thinking of the world that are not biblical. And so we lose our saltiness and light-bearing. Now, the way out of that is to remember we are a counterculture. The first word to the first man called to the Lord, Abraham, negative, leave. He's called to break with his country, culture, and kin. In the world, but not of the world. We're members of the city of God, not the city of man. And so we've got to regain that the countercultural stance today and remember how we're against so much. Now, that means that pastors have to understand the world. You mentioned the men of Issachar, reading the signs of the times. Our Lord says, you can read the weather. You're all great meteorologists. You missed God's moment when it came. You're not reading the signs of the times. St. Paul, I love the fact he gives the tribute to David, Acts 13. He served God's purpose in his generation. Now, to do that, he must have known his generation. So we need pastors who understand the times to know what Israel should do. Because sometimes we engage it constructively, sometimes we avoid it and steer clear of it. But we've got to understand the times. And that's a challenge. Now, not every pastor can be a jack of all trades and know everything. Super preacher, super counselor, super church built. No. So you need to have others in the church who come in who help you understand. Some churches I know welcome crazy people like me. Because part of my calling is always to try and make sense of the times. I love that verse in Chronicles. Some pastors like it, many don't. But it's a vital ingredient to know where we are, to know what we should do. The academic notion of this is what's called the standpoint theory. Where you are determines what you see. And what you see is the result of where you stand. And so many evangelicals forget that. And so our basic stance, my basic stance is always looking at America, politics, the world, from the perspective of the kingdom. I'm a foreigner. I'm an admirer of this country. My first loyalty is not to either political party or even to America. It's to the Lord. Mm-hmm. Where does what's happening today affected by my seeing it in the light of the kingdom? So standpoint theory is incredibly important, and Christians need to think, where do you stand? Now, we all have other allegiances, our families, sports teams we love, the businesses we work in, the parties we support politically, and so on. They're all important, and they add a perspective. But the deepest perspective, the ultimate standpoint, is for us faith and the kingdom.
It's good. I don't know how much time we've got left. Oz, I'd love to talk to you about a couple of your new works that you've just recently put out. One of the articles I read as we were putting together the times for our pastors this month, that'll come out on Tuesday, was from Focus on the Family that said, America is simultaneously in revival and revolt. And as I looked at your new book, America Agonistes, America's 250th, and the restoration of a nation in conflict with itself and its past, that reminded me of that article, and it intrigued me a little bit. So I'd love for you just to talk a little bit. I know we're going to go through your Magna Carta of Humanity with all of our pastors in our ministry fellowship, but I'm really intrigued, and we had a brief conversation about this when you and Nick and I were talking about other potential resources for our fellows. Could you just share a little bit about this book and what you were really trying to address in this book specifically?
Well, I'm trying to write a quartet on the American crisis. Book number 1, Our Civilizational Moment. That looks at the West with a wider angle lens. Book number 2, America Agonistes, came out a couple of weeks ago. It's on America at 250. And then I've got 2 more coming, and the 4th one is a Christian response to the crisis. But I think America Agonistes addresses 250, and while obviously the president will have a big, beautiful celebration, the danger is that Americans don't think, where are we? And where have we slipped? Where have we gone wrong? And where do we need to put it right before the Lord? And so I hope Americans will be American Christians, followers of Jesus, will be in the forefront of that reflection and a call to confession. You know, Lincoln, 1860s, an incredible national confession that the horror of the Civil War was brought on by the sin of slavery. Now, isn't that true today? There are so many things that are wrong, and they need to be put right. And all the secular ways of putting them right simply don't work. They make the problem worse. Obviously, for us, the deepest thing is the cross. But do Christians have the courage to show how the cross is not just relevant for my sins or our individual sins, but for the nation's sins? Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement, was not for individual Jewish sins. It was because of the scandal of the golden calf, a national sin. And I think in the same way, America needs to confess, and America needs a profound atonement. And I think only Christians can lead that whole discussion next year. But also talking about the positive, how many Christians can tell you 10 first principles from Exodus and Deuteronomy that are vital to any politics of justice and freedom? Very few can.
That would be a great resource to add to our church toolkit for 2026.
Yep. Next time on The Narrative. Oz, this has been deeply enlightening, and I know every answer to a question produces like 3 more questions. Where can our audience find more of Os Guinness out there?
Well, it's kind of you to ask, David. The 2 books I mentioned are Civilizational Moment and the new one, America Agonistes, are both on Amazon. You know, I'm in my 80s now, and if it took the normal publishing schedule, I wouldn't be around on the earth when the books came out. So we decided to self-publish through Amazon, so you can find them on Amazon.com, and you can publish 4 books in 1 year that way. I gave in America Agonistes on a certain 2 hours later, the Kindle was up. 1 day later, the paperback was up. And 2 days later, the hardback was up. I mean, Amazon is quite extraordinary. Of course, there's no marketing. So I'd be grateful if anyone interested goes up there and follows it up.
Well, I know that many of our listeners will do exactly that. And again, we just want to thank you for taking the time. I know you are very busy and for just sharing with us and our pastors and our listeners on what are the times and what are the ways that we should go in them. And so thank you so much, Dr. Oz. And please join us again next time on The Narrative.
Well, thank you. And you know, when I came to Columbus, I've often said to others afterwards, I have never seen a city so united, so visionary, and so entrepreneurial. So the things I saw in Columbus that day were quite extraordinary, and I'd say deeply, well done, and God bless you.
Welcome back anytime. Thank you, sir.
Thanks, Oscar.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of The Narrative, presented by CCV and produced by Wessler Media. If you found today's episode insightful, leave us a review or rating and subscribe anywhere you get your podcasts. We're your hosts, Mike Andrews, Aaron Baer, and David Mahan, and we'll see you next time on The Narrative.